Hey guys, we are back updating the power rankings for Hell's Kitchen Head Chefs Only following episode 7. And this was another pretty interesting episode to break down here. A lot of interesting stuff, a lot of interesting developments with certain people, but we'll get to that soon enough. But we have 12 people to talk about. Let's waste some more time. Let's go into the video. So starting off at number 12, we have the latest booth from the season, and here we have Megan. And this was an interesting downfall for Megan here, where we have yet another episode where we don't really see Megan making many mistakes cooking-wise during the actual service, where the show is focusing more on another person's mistakes, and yet Megan still takes the fall for it, where her team once again puts her up for seemingly not being a good leader, which is pretty interesting here. And we actually see Ramsey follow through in eliminating her for not having the confidence of her team, which I found to be an interesting result there. And to be fair, I feel like there are definitely signs throughout the episode that she could have been taken out, even though a lot of the focus during the actual service was about Amanda making tons of mistakes and ultimately costing her team the service there. But obviously, Megan was someone who I was relatively high on for a lot of the season, and with her being a relatively early boot, she's probably my biggest miss of the season so far, where I expected her to do well, only for her to be booted relatively early, so again, you can't get them all, but she's now out of the game to where she's here at number 12. And with that, we have 11 people left in the game to talk about. As usual, I'll be ranking them based on how likely I think they are to win the game based on their edit and current game position, but at number 11, the person I believe is the least likely to win from this point on is Amanda. And Amanda is someone who I still feel pretty similar about. I feel like before this episode, she wasn't really getting much content. A lot of it felt very service level, only for this episode to be the first time she really gets a visibility spike, only for a lot of it to be negative, where she ends up making tons of mistakes during the actual service and is eventually the one who technically loses the service for the team due to her messing up the veal there, which is obviously pretty bad. And while she does avoid the block there, despite her getting all this screen time, I feel like the fact that she hasn't really gotten much content, only for her to do pretty poorly in the service, is not a great sign here. Now, I'm not necessarily saying she's going to be the next boot, as considering that the next episode is the Cook for Your Life challenge. There's obviously some variants that can result from there, but at the end of the day, I feel like Amanda's someone who I have very little confidence in to actually win the game, even if she survives the next week. But it's for that reason that I have her here at number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and we have another person who I feel about the same on, if I'm being honest, and here I have Anne-Marie, and this was another pretty mediocre episode for her here, where she gets mostly base level content, and beyond that has a bad service, makes a mistake, is put up by her team, and while she does survive, I feel like she's not really someone I'm looking at as a contender. I feel like this episode didn't really move the needle for me, and that's a big reason why she's still here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and this person is also remaining around the bottom rung of the list for me, and here we have Britney. And again, this was just kind of a fine episode for Britney. I feel like there wasn't anything too spectacular with her actual service or her challenge performance here. I feel like this was just kind of an okay episode, if I'm being honest, which again is not really enough to drag her down too much, but I feel like compared to the rest of the field, it's not enough for her to move up, which is why she's still here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we have yet another person who I feel about the same on, if I'm being honest, and here we have Brandon. And again, I feel like Brandon's someone who, despite him seeming like a competent chef on paper, I feel like he's not really being presented as a leader for his team, and not really someone who I feel like the show is propping up that much, where on one hand, he does compliment Egypt during the service, talking about how Egypt is becoming a better leader, which I feel like is more so propping up Egypt compared to Brandon himself. But at the same time, you also see him complain about Lulu and how Lulu's making mistakes. And I feel like he just doesn't come across as a leader to me. I feel like the show isn't really presenting him that way. And I feel like by the end, it's just going to bite Brandon in the butt and take him out of the game. So for those reasons, I feel like with the way Brandon's being presented, I don't really see how he goes on to win the game from this point on, which is why I do still have him here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and we have someone who I've actually been going down on as the weeks have gone on, and I feel like this episode was just more of the same, and that person is Lulu. And I feel like the last couple weeks have been kind of a rocky stretch for Lulu, if I'm being honest here, where it seems like in the last couple of episodes, we've been seeing her making more and more mistakes, and this episode was more the same, where we see her doing pretty poorly in the challenge, we see her making mistakes during the service, and I feel like we are seeing more and more of Lulu's flaws at this point, where considering that we are seeing them relatively early in the season, it wouldn't shock me if she's a boot relatively soon, possibly even the one that goes out in the Cook for Your Life challenge, which would be a pretty interesting result there. But even if she survives that week, I feel like with us starting to see more of her flaws as a chef, I just feel like it's just a matter of time now before she actually gets taken out of the game. So I'm not feeling that great about Lulu anymore. I feel like she's someone who has been surpassed by plenty of other people, which is why she has fallen to number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and we have someone who is remaining around the same spot as last week, even though they got a decent amount of focus in this episode, but we do have Hannah. And this was an interesting episode for Hannah, to say the least, where she got a lot of focus during the challenge with her pounding the meat and really costing her team there, which is pretty unfortunate. But really the bulk of her content comes after the reward challenge, where we obviously see her considering quitting the game, considering that's the anniversary of her husband passing away. And we see her having to talk to Michelle and being comforted by her, being encouraged to remain in the game, which is obviously a pretty touching moment there. And obviously it's positive content for Hannah. It's obviously pretty good personal content. And in some ways you can compare this to Egypt, someone who also got a lot of personal content when he considered quitting the game, and obviously followed that up with a pretty big turnaround. However, I feel like I didn't get that same effect with Hannah here, where obviously you can excuse some of that with her team losing a service and her making a mistake during the service, which is obviously understandable. However, at the same time, I feel like Hannah herself doesn't get propped up as much as she probably could have, and how she could have talked about this being a big turnaround. It just felt like it kind of had to be there, if I'm being honest, which I feel like is probably not the greatest sign, if I'm being perfectly honest. So again, I do have to question how much of this is truly propelling Hannah's story in the future, but I feel like it was at least enough to have her around the same spot as last week. So because of that, she's here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, we have someone who I mentioned not too long ago, but we do have Egypt. And I feel like Egypt has been climbing back up the power rankings considering his big turnaround, as I feel like we once again saw him being propped up, where it seems like he is genuinely becoming a better leader, with him doing pretty well in the challenge during the actual service. As I mentioned earlier, Brandon does say that he has become a better leader, and we have seen him doing better. So in some ways, I feel like what we saw from him in the premiere is starting to shine through once again, which I think is pretty good for his chances here. Now, by the same token, I do admit that he got a bit overexposed during the first couple of episodes, and there's obviously a debate that he could eventually be taken out, or as his growth arc person during the season. So I'm not saying that Egypt is locked in to win by any means, but I feel like the fact that he's had this pretty big turnaround is a pretty good sign for his chances. And while it could also be set up for him being sniped out of the game in the next round, I feel like it was enough to have him at least as high at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and I'm actually surprised this person is as high as they are, as I feel like this person's been kind of middling so far across the season, but I feel like they have been sort of climbing up slowly but surely. But number 4, we do have Joe. And as I mentioned earlier, I don't think Joe's entirely dead in the edit, where I feel like he had a pretty solid premiere. And while he's been kind of under the radar in a lot of the early episodes, I feel like more recently we have been seeing more from him. And in some ways, he has become a bit of a narrator across the season, being shown as a pretty competent chef, which I think is all pretty good for his chances. To where, while I was kind of lower on him earlier in the season, I feel like with other people starting to fall off a bit, I feel like it was enough to have him at least as high at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and this is actually the same top 3 that I had last week, and it's actually the same person, number 3 again, but we do have Wit. And I feel like this episode gave me what I was looking for here with Wit, where after she had a pretty big episode last week, she kind of got a cooldown episode here, didn't really get too much content outside the actual service. And we see her once again doing pretty well, all things considered, not really making many mistakes. And we are once again establishing her as this pretty big contender to win the game, which is all pretty good there. Though I feel like the reason she's not higher is, in some ways, I can still see her as being this final boss for the actual season, as opposed to someone who actually goes on the win. And while that could definitely change in the future to where she could eventually become the front runner, I feel like that's just how I feel about Wit at this point, where she'll definitely be in it for the long haul, definitely make it towards the end of the game. It's just a question whether she'll actually win. But I feel like for now, I feel like I'm a bit more confident in the top 2, which is why she's still here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and we actually had the same person at number 2 again as last week, but we do have Kyle. And again, I feel like this was another good episode for Kyle, where he's not really being overexposed in the way that you would expect, but at the same time, he's still performing well, doing pretty well in the actual challenge. He does pretty well in the actual service here. So again, I feel like this was another pretty decent episode for Kyle here. I think something that could harm him is whether he'll be seen as a true leader or not. I think that'll definitely be a deciding factor, at least between him and Wit, but obviously we'll have to see how that battle plays down the road. And again, I feel like if Wit does establish herself as a stronger leader, I could see a world where Wit surpasses Kyle down the road, but I feel like it's still relatively early in the season. But I feel like for now, considering where we currently are, I feel like it was still enough to have Kyle relatively high, considering I feel like Kyle is meant to be more of a rooting interest at this point compared to Wit. So I feel like for those reasons, I still have him here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the person I believe is the most likely to win Hell's Kitchen, head chefs only at this point, is still Anthony. And I feel like this is just what the doctor ordered here, where after getting a lot of focus last week, Anthony gets a cooldown episode here, but still does pretty well, where he does pretty well in the actual service here. Now, you could knock him a bit for losing in a heads up to Wit in the actual challenge, but even then, the dish was pretty good. And considering that Wit is meant to be a top contender anyway, I don't really knock that too much against Anthony here. And considering that it was a cooldown for episode for him anyway, I feel like this episode didn't really change much. I still feel like Anthony's the front runner to win in my eyes, which is why he's still here at number 1. And there we go. That'll do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. Really helps out with the channel. Now I'll be back again next week to update the power rankings again, so you can look forward to that. I'm covering Survivor 47 and doing weekly power rankings of that show, so you can expect weekly power rankings on that. I'm on Patreon and have a YouTube membership, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description. And you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.